All right, we're going to finish up our unit on the introduction of plants with arguably the most important group, and that would be the phylum Anthophyta. And the phylum Anthophyta is one and the same with the group known as Angiosperms. Now, Anthophyta is the phylum name. Angiosperm is just a common name for flowering plants. So when we're talking about anthophytes, we're talking about angiosperms, we're talking about flowering plants. They all mean the same thing. And what makes them such an important group is their success. Approximately 400,000 species, and it's approximate because I found other estimates of how many species of anthophytes there are, or angiosperms, but the reason for the approximation is because we haven't found them all yet. It's just like animal species, we haven't found them all yet, and other species. But to put that into perspective with some of the other groups that we studied, if you'll recall, bryophytes, there's only about 10,000, and these are approximations or roundings also. So about 10,000 species of bryophytes, in other words, mosses and their relatives, mosses and their allies, in other words, non-vascular seedless plants. There are only about 12,000 pterophytes, in other words, ferns and their allies, the vascular seedless plants. So that is an evolutionary advancement, and these are species that are living today. These are extant species, not including extinct species. There were many more extinct species of bryophytes and many more extinct species of pterophytes. And then we get to the gymnosperms, the vascular seed-producing plants that produce their seeds in cones or on cones. But there are only about 1,000 species of those, and actually probably a little less than 1,000 species. So if hopefully that helps put into perspective the vast number of anthophytes, angiosperms, flowering plants. They are by far the most successful kind of plant on the planet. And they appeared about 125 million years ago. And so I want to put that into perspective too. And so we're going to switch here to a figure that I found that shows the evolutionary time scale here. So all the way back here, well, we're looking at the entire evolution of plants here. So if you'll notice, the land plants appear here about 450 million years ago, and those would be mosses, and that's in the Ordovician. You can't read it here, but this is the Ordovician period, which is the period just after the Cambrian explosion, right? We have the Cambrian period, then the Ordovician period. So about 450 million years ago, we have the appearance of the first land plants, and they were the mosses, or they were moss-like anyway. And just to look at the entire span, it spans about 400 million years until we get to the flowering plants in the Cretaceous. So about one quarter of the way into the Cretaceous here, we see the appearance of flowering plants. So if we go back to the appearance of land plants, at the end of the Silurian, we go from the non-vascular seedless plants to the vascular seedless plants. So it didn't take that long, maybe about 30 million years, to evolve vascular tissue. So these are the ferns and their allies, and club mosses and horsetails, and they evolved from that point on until during the Carboniferous period, there were forests that covered the entire world of ferns and their allies. So, we're talking vascular seedless plants the size of trees, growing all over the planet. And they are the ones that fossilized and that we now dig up as coal. And that's why we call this the Carboniferous period, because that's when all the coal, or all the species that turned into coal, that's when they were alive. So the ferns and their allies basically dominate the Earth from the end of the Silurian all the way to about the middle of the Triassic, when we have the evolution of the seed plants. And the first were the gymnosperms. So the seed plants that are producing seeds on cones. So the cone-bearing vascular seed plants evolved about in the middle of the Triassic. And then it's not for quite a while until we get to the Cretaceous that we have the evolution of flowering plants. And flowering plants now dominate. So obviously the flowering plants were much more successful than any of these other forms of plants. And they have outcompeted all other forms of plants. And then, of course, at the end of the Cretaceous, about 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs died out. And I just want to remind you, too, there was an extinction event here at the end of the Permian, the biggest mass extinction that we've discovered at the end of the Permian. And it's also interesting to note that the seed plants then evolved shortly after that mass extinction. So there may be a connection there. I also want to remind you that, note that land plants or plants are evolving onto land before animals do, basically. And that makes sense because animals need something to eat. And I want to remind you also that plants did not move onto land alone or evolve on land alone. They brought along their mycorrhizal relationship, their mutualistic symbiotic relationship with fungi known as mycorrhiza. We think that that partnership is part of the reason, or part of the ways that plants were able to be successful on land at all. All right, so what is this huge evolutionary advantage? Well, it's basically being able to use animals. You know, animals had been evolving for quite a long time before the flowering plants came along, and flowering plants were able to take advantage of those animals, and that is a huge evolutionary advantage. So flowers basically evolved to attract animals, and the first reason to attract animals would be for pollination, to transfer pollen from one flower to another. You know, think of honeybees. That's their main job. In their partnership with plants anyway, that's their main job. And flowers aren't the only way that plants use animals. Also, the flower, the female part of the flower is the ovaries, or contains the ovaries, and the ovaries are what develop into fruit. And then animals will come along and eat the fruit, and open up the fruit and disperse the seeds, or pick up the piece of fruit and carry it for a long distance and open it up and disperse the seeds, or eat the fruit and the seeds will pass through their digestive system and they'll poop it out somewhere far from the parent plant. So fruit is also all about forming partnerships with animals and attracting animals to disperse seeds. So we have animals that are being used by flowering plants to transfer pollen from flower to flower, and we have animals being used by plants to disperse their seeds. And that's what's made flowering plants so successful. If you'll recall, that's an example of coevolution. So flowering plants have co-evolved with animals to be successful. Now, because the phylum Anthophyta is so successful, there's a lot of diversity. Right? The more successful, the more number of species, the more number of niches filled. That means more diversity. And so we tend to divide up the phylum Anthophyta into a number of ways. Only one of those ways, though, is actually actually leads to classification. And I'll come back to that idea in a minute. So just first of all, just listing them here, we've got monocots versus dicots. We've got woody versus herbaceous, or also known as non-woody. And we've got annuals versus biennials versus perennials. So this is just kind of like casual ways that we divide up the phylum Anthophyta. But when it comes to monocots and dicots, that does lead to subclassification into classes. So if you'll notice here, there is the class Monocotyledonnae and class Dicotyledonnae, both of those being kind of tongue twisters. But we're going to look on the next slide at what the difference is between monocots and dicots, as they're known, just commonly. So we'll come back to that. Monocots are mostly herbaceous, which means they're non-woody. Dicots, they're about 50-50 woody and non-woody. And when we're talking about woody, you know what wood is. Trees are made of wood. Bushes are woody. So basically shrubs, that's what you want to be thinking. And just a side note here, we're looking at angiosperms, Anthophyta, angiosperms, same thing, flowering plants, but gymnosperms are all woody. But only some anthophytes, only some angiosperms are woody, and that's about half of the dicots are woody. So I just wanted to point that out, that gymnosperms are all woody, pine trees and so forth. And what we're looking at here is a twig, 3-year-old shoot, and shoots grow from their tips, right? Apical meristem. Meristem is a term that refers to a region of growth. That's where a lot of mitosis is taking place, and that's where shoots grow from. They grow from their tip. If you'll recall, when we were studying mitosis, we looked at onion root tip under the microscope, and the whole reason we were looking at the tip is because that's where the meristematic tissue is, that's where cells are dividing, that's where mitosis is going on. So it's a great place to look for mitosis. So that's how shoots increase in length, and that increase in length is known as primary growth. So this alludes to the idea that there might be a kind of secondary growth, and that's involved in woody plants. Woody plants grow, they increase in girth, they increase in thickness, and that's what's known as secondary growth. And we're going to look at that in more detail on another slide. And then we have annuals and biennials and perennials, and we're also going to look at that on another slide, so we don't need to deal with that right now. But those might sound familiar to you if you've ever gone to the garden store and to buy flowers to plant in your garden. They basically have to do with the timing of reproduction in the life cycle, and also whether or not the plant survives from one season to the next. All right, so what's this deal? What's this big deal about monocots and dicots? Well, again, phylum Anthophyta is divided up into two classes, monocotyledonnae and dicotyledonnae. And there are some major differences, a lot of different characteristics that are different between these two groups. So that's why it's used as a way to subclassify the phylum. And of course, these must be clades. The whole reason that they share these characteristics is because they have common ancestry. And the names of the classes come from this concept known as a cotyledon. And a cotyledon is known as a seed leaf. So this is a leaf that is produced, that is part of the embryo. It's produced from the embryo. It's part of the embryo inside the seed. And it's a non-photosynthetic leaf. But it's still involved in nutrition because it's involved in transferring nutrients, the stored nutrients that are in the seed. If you'll recall, that's known as endosperm. So it's in monocots, it's involved in transferring that food, that stored food, to the embryo. So when it's time for the embryo to restart its development, come out of dormancy and germinate and start growing, the cotyledon, the seed leaf, is used to transfer the nutrition, the food, from the endosperm to the growing and developing embryo. In monocots, there's only one seed leaf. Okay, and primarily it takes up most of the embryo that we see in this image of a corn seed, a corn kernel, which is a seed. In dicots, there are two seed leaves. There are two cotyledons. And in dicots, in many dicots, not all dicots, the cotyledons, the seed leaves, absorb all of the endosperm. So like this is a bean we're looking at here, and if you split open a bean, you can see the embryo. So that's the embryo right there. But everything else that's filling the inside of the seed are the two cotyledons. You may have noted that a bean is pretty easy to split right down the middle. And what you have on both sides, mainly, are the two cotyledons that have absorbed all of the endosperm. So the nutrition is actually absorbed by those seed leaves, absorbed by the cotyledons, and then the nutrition, the food, is then transferred to the embryo when it's time for the embryo to begin its development. So they really have the same function in monocots and dicots. It's just that in dicots, a lot of times the cotyledons will absorb the endosperm. We also see a difference in venation. The veins, the vascular tissue, the veins that are transporting things throughout the leaf. So if you look at a leaf of a monocot, the veins are going to be parallel. They're going to run parallel the length of the leaf. So grass is a great example. And again, corn. And by the way, corn is just a grass. It's in the grass family. A network of veins, however, like you see in a broadleaf, most broadleaf trees have a network of veins. So it's a branching network. It's like a net of veins, not running parallel to each other. That's what you see in dicots. When it comes to flowers, and remember, these are flowering plants, so both monocots and dicots have flowers. But in a monocot, the whorls, the number of whorls, that's a term that refers to, the circular pattern of petals and reproductive structures. They're in multiples of 3 in monocots, and they're in multiples of 4 or 5 in dicots. So you can just count the number of petals, for example, or the number of stamens of a flower in order to figure out whether it's a monocot or a dicot. Here we're looking at a cross-section of a stem. So if you cut a stem and then look at it on end, you can see the vascular bundles. You can see how the vascular bundles are arranged. And sometimes you have to use a microscope to be able to see this. But in a monocot, the vascular bundles, and those would be bundles of both xylem and phloem, are just kind of scattered. Each bundle has both xylem and phloem, but the bundles are scattered throughout the stem, not in any particular arrangement, not in any particular pattern in monocots. And just a reminder here that most monocots are herbaceous. An example of a monocot that's woody would be like a palm tree, but technically palm trees aren't even really trees. But anyway, on the dicot side, and remember the dicots can be both herbaceous and woody, the vascular bundles are arranged in a circle. So they do have a circular pattern. And that partially explains the secondary growth, the production of wood. And we'll be looking at that on the next slide. Finally, the roots are different between monocots and dicots. The roots of monocots are what they refer to as fibrous. And again, there's really no pattern to them. They're just kind of, they're very hairy and they fan out in all directions. So those are fibrous roots. Whereas in dicots, there's a taproot. There's a main root that runs right down the middle, and then other roots branch off of the taproot. So a carrot is a great example of that. What you eat as a carrot is basically the taproot of the plant. And that points out another function of roots is to store food, to store nutrients. So the nutrients are made during photosynthesis, and then those nutrients are transferred by phloem to the roots, and that's where the nutrients are stored for later use. And that's the difference between monocots and dicots. And I just added this just to give you an indication of just how many angiosperms, flowering plants, are dicots versus monocots. So about 75% are dicots. So that somewhat suggests that being a dicot is more advantageous. So one of the things that has made dicots so successful is the development of secondary growth. In other words, the formation of wood. And that has allowed them to grow a lot bigger than herbaceous plants that don't form wood. So wood is very strong, and it helps to support the plant. So again, secondary growth is an increase in girth. And just like primary growth, an increase in length, it depends on what we call meristematic tissue. In other words, well, in primary growth, it's apical meristems, apical referring to the tips. The tips of shoots have apical meristems where cell division is going on, and that's how they increase in length. When it comes to secondary growth, the increase in girth, there are these meristematic tissue that are known as cambiums. Okay, so the green here in this diagram is the vascular cambium. It's meristematic tissue. In other words, it's cells that are undergoing mitosis and dividing, and they're making vascular tissue. They're making xylem on the inside, and they're making phloem on the outside. So there are basically two kinds of stem cells in this Cambrian vascular cambium, and the cells on the inside are making xylem on the inside, and the cells on the outside of the cambium are making phloem on the outside. And the growth rings that you see when you cut a tree is the xylem that is laid down year after year after year. So everything on the inside is xylem, and that's really what you refer to as wood. And remember, xylem is dead, whereas phloem is alive. The cells that make up the xylem are all dead. And in the middle of the tree, that's where you're going to find what's known as the heartwood. And the heartwood is inactive xylem. So it's not only dead, it's not being used to transport water and minerals up. Remember, that's the function of xylem, is to transport water and minerals up. So in the very center of the tree, you're going to find heartwood that's not doing anything, but it is helping to support the tree. Outward of that is active xylem. That's known as the sapwood, because that actually has aqueous solution, water and minerals running through it, primarily upwards. That's the direction that xylem transports, is up in the tree. And so it's carrying the water and nutrients up into the tree. The phloem, if you'll recall, is what transports the sugars that are made during photosynthesis throughout the plant. And notice that it's just under, or actually it's part of, notice the bracket here, it's part of the bark, what we would refer to as the bark. So the bark is actually two layers. There's the periderm, which includes the cork cambium, which is another meristematic tissue that's producing what you would normally think of as the bark, the tough outer covering of the tree. And then just inside of that is the phloem. So if you strip off the bark, you're stripping off the phloem. If you're not careful, I mean, you could carefully try to strip off just the periderm and leave the cork cam, or I'm sorry, the living phloem behind. But for the most part, if you take off the bark all the way around a tree, you're probably going to accidentally at least damage or ruin the phloem in the process, and that will kill the tree. The tree will no longer be able to transport nutrients up, down into the roots or up from the roots through the phloem. So that's something that you want to avoid. Like if you're mowing around a tree or using a weed eater around a tree, try not to knock the bark off all the way around the bottom of the tree, or it will result in the death of the tree. So primarily the dicots, class Dicotyledonnae, are the ones that show secondary growth and produce wood and are woody plants, or at least 50% of them are woody plants. And the monocots are primarily herbaceous. They don't have secondary growth. They don't produce wood. They're non-woody. Finally, angiosperms can be divided up according to their life cycle and their reproductive cycle in terms of the timing. And the first thing to point out here, we're comparing annuals and biennials and perennials, and about 90% of all plants are perennial. So right off the bat, you can see that suggests it's a much more successful strategy than being an annual or a biennial. And when it comes to annual versus biennial, the biennials are have the lowest number of species. So it's the least successful of the three strategies. But let's just take a look at the annuals first. So if you go to the garden store, you want to buy some flowers to put in your garden. If you buy annuals, you're going to have to replant them every year. Go buy them and replant them every year. And that's because the seed germinates, the plant grows. That's referred to here as vegetative growth. So the plant's growing and photosynthesizing, and then eventually it flowers, and the flowers are reproductive structures that eventually result in seeds. The plant dies, and its seeds are the only things that can go on and go on living, right? Because the parent plant dies. Every year, every season, the parent plant dies. So it's only the seeds that can go on and produce more plants. So that's an annual. Biennials do pretty much the same thing. It's just that they flower every other year. So the seed germinates, there's vegetative growth in the first season, then it goes dormant over if we're talking in a temperate climate, it goes dormant over the winter. And then there's a second round of vegetative growth the second year, and then it flowers and produces seeds and dies off. And again, so the seeds are the only things that survive after the second year. When it comes to perennials, they can live for a long time. Like one of the oldest species on the planet is like a 3,000-year-old tree. So we have vegetative growth. We have the seed germinating in vegetative growth. We have flowering and seed production, and then dormancy, and then the plant will wake back up again in the spring and grow some more, and then flower at a certain time and produce more seeds. So it's constantly living from season to season to season and constantly producing seeds. And you can see how that would be a much more successful strategy of passing your genes on to the next generation. And so it's much more evolutionarily successful. And that explains why most plants are perennials. All right, so that's it for your introduction to the Kingdom Plantae. We're not going to go into great detail. Hopefully you watched those, the Secret Life of Mosses, the Secret Life of Ferns, the Secret Life of Flowering Plants. That's where you get a lot of the details about their life cycle and how they reproduce. But otherwise, we're not going to go into any more great detail about the structure and function of plants. So we're just going to move on to the animal kingdom. I'll see you there.